They say first impressions are everything. If that's true, then SpaceChem must be a terrible game. Even for the kind of person who sees an incomprehensible screenshot of molecules covered in symbols and thinks, this is the one for me, SpaceChem still doesn't put its best Waldo forward. Right away, the game commits the grievous sin of linking to an external video as its tutorial. Better hope the player has a reliable connection, or the Zachtronics channel doesn't go down, or the codec doesn't get garbled, or YouTube doesn't go under, or a million other ors, because if it does, SpaceChem will be even less penetrable than it is now. For a small, independent developer doing their first commercial release, a few rough edges are to be expected, but this is surprising nonetheless. At the very least, this tutorial should have been rendered in-game so as to ensure it would always be visible. As for the video itself, it suffers from being stuck in a sort of half-trailer mode where it almost seems to be trying to sell you on the game even after your purchase, possibly as a concession since it's publicly visible. A more straightforward guide to the first mission or two would be a far more effective tutorial, but then again it can be hard to know when you've crossed the line into condescension. Once you go hands-on, things get a little better since you're at least involved in the process, but the opening stages are excessively rigid and introduce too many concepts at once. The very first one even goes out of its way to include the rotation command for no reason. Later tutorials are presented as text dumps, which also contain unnecessary information and appear before the new mechanic has even been seen, leaving you to imagine what it's talking about. Of course, you can view these again once you've tinkered around with things, but it's a rough start, especially considering how complicated the rules are to begin with. Luckily for us, first impressions can be deceiving. Once you move past these awkward beginnings, the reward is well worth the effort. After a rough learning spike at the start, additional mechanics are introduced at such even intervals they become much easier to digest, but that's not the only secret to their success. Even ignoring the explanation text, most new mechanics are accompanied by a simplistic puzzle contrived to push the player in the right direction. Sometimes the way this is accomplished is pretty clever. This early production stage is split in half by a rock, making it so that the pipes leading from the two inputs end up being a different length, wordlessly introducing the idea that inputs can arrive with different timings. These kinds of situations better reinforce lessons while maintaining a high level of engagement nonetheless. It could be said that these stages have more in common with regular puzzles than the open-ended problem-solving style, but it's worth taking that trade-off occasionally to drive home a point. Thankfully, even within the tutorials, there's often still enough leeway to allow for creative techniques, although that's probably mainly because the core mechanics are just so strong by themselves. The sheer amount of depth built into the basics of SpaceChem is staggering. Assuming you're all good scientists, you won't accept that claim without some evidence, so here's a small sample. Leaving a Waldo facing a wall can execute a single command perpetually. Moving bonders to the input or output zone can dramatically smooth out some operations. Outputting before dropping off a molecule makes a reactor safe from collisions if a pipe backs up. Flip-flops can be chained in complex combinations, allowing you to count to any number and perform operations an uneven amount of times. If that's not convincing enough, one player created a brainfuck interpreter in the sandbox, demonstrating that the mechanics have enough complexity to be considered Turing complete. Totally justified use of the word brainfuck, by the way. With its red and blue Waldos, SpaceChem makes for a great visual metaphor of how depth arises. Two or more different mechanics which overlap with each other to produce a new effect. In this case, that overlap is often literal. Discovering the more advanced techniques offers the kind of eureka moments you'd hope for in a standard puzzle game, but more than that, they become tools for you to reuse in later stages. Unfortunately, some actions are hidden behind a right-click, which will probably snag some players even though the game encourages you to right-click everything, but the only really questionably obtuse mechanic is the way bonders resolve conflicts. Each bonder pad has a priority which determines the order they're checked before a bond is created or destroyed. This can result in seemingly inconsistent behavior depending on how your reactor is arranged, but it is actually deterministic. Shuffling pads around allows you to get the result you want. It's up for debate whether utilizing bonder priority to your benefit is the proper way to play or not. This will probably depend on how you imagine a SpaceChem reactor works, what kind of best practices a SpaceChem engineer should employ, and crucially, whether this technique makes that pretend job more or less fun. Similarly, Zachtronics could have taken either approach by encouraging or disabling the use of priority. To nullify it, priority could have cycled through every possible combination in a random order, thereby making it useless. Alternatively, a more simplistic choice would have been to put a small number on each pad, embracing it as a nuance for the player to tinker with. In a sense, the game does this with Waldos already. Red always fires before blue, which is a fine way of resolving potential conflicts. The important thing is that the player can easily distinguish between the two and plan around this constraint. In its current incarnation, Bonder priority could be a lot worse, but if you decide to use it, then you might find yourself blindly rearranging pads until you get the result you want, which is obviously less than ideal. Fortunately, this quirk is the exception. For the most part, the more inventive techniques unfold from established mechanics interacting predictably with each other. This is perhaps the most crucial part of crafting an enjoyable problem-solving game because it allows players to develop new techniques based on existing ones. If you learn how to do A, then learn how to do B, you'll eventually figure out you can combine A and B to accomplish C. There might be multiple ways to foster this mentality, but the Zachtronics approach seems to offer the ultimate template. The key is that each action has a discrete time and space representation. In other words, the playfield is divided into a grid, and time is divided into cycles. When you think of it this way, SpaceChem almost seems more like a weird offshoot of the turn-based strategy genre than the puzzle genre. In a sense, it's like a battle where you can't change tactics midway, you have to plan for every eventuality in advance. Anyway, the point is that this clearly segmented approach to both space and time allows you to reliably predict the outcome of any combination of events. These kinds of combinations are usually discovered inside reactors, but even reactors themselves could be thought of as building blocks when the action escalates to the production levels. The introduction of these stages is the exact moment when SpaceChem transcends mere greatness. On top of all the mechanics and techniques that apply internally, linking them together adds a sort of meta consideration about how to break an even larger problem into functions which have to interface through a limited channel. This brings its own benefits, like a drastically increased Waldo count, as well as challenges, like dependency and timing issues. It's in these stages where the open-ended nature of the game is most clearly felt, the main trade-off being that some solutions can take quite a while to set up, dampening enthusiasm at times. For the most part, this strikes the right balance though. It feels bigger and more taxing, but not pointlessly so. If getting one reactor to work is gratifying, then seeing several interact with each other is naturally some multiple of that. These may be the highlight of the game, but there's also at least one small downside. In research puzzles, inputs can be generated as quickly as possible, but in production stages there's a fixed limit on the rate of new materials, which puts an artificial cap on optimization. The cycle histograms for sigma ethylene demonstrate this plateau very clearly. Usually, scores will trail off on the left-hand side, indicating that the most highly dedicated players have pushed themselves just a little further than anyone else, but in this case there's an abrupt stop where a relatively large portion of the player base have gotten close to the minimum number of cycles. My solution falls into that bracket even though it's far from optimal. This red Waldo does the most important job, fusing hydrogen to make carbon, but it has an unnecessarily long path which could be tightened up with a bit of effort. Not to mention the massive efficiency gains that could be made by restructuring this reactor so both Waldos are busy at all times. Unfortunately, that effort would go unrewarded because my current solution basically keeps pace with the amount of hydrogen provided. Optimizing this any further would leave the red Waldo sitting around waiting for more molecules to arrive. There's probably many more efficient solutions than this one which are being awarded more or less the same score. In a sense, it's as though the game is denying players the opportunity to see how efficient their creation really is. Granted, this only seems to be an issue on a few specific stages where it's possible to outpace the inputs, but it's still disappointing because starting pipes will only cause collisions if you're very careless. Filling these pipes up as quickly as possible would only cause a tiny loss in complexity in exchange for ensuring that players could always push their designs to the limit. While we're on the topic of histograms, it's worth examining them further. First of all, it's easy to see that these act as an incentive for players to improve their mastery of the mechanics, which is then capitalized on in the later stages where a high level of competency is expected. The real question is why they opted for a graph at all when leaderboards have been the standard method of comparison for decades, but it's a great choice considering the style of gameplay. Excluding bosses, SpaceChem is a game with zero skill-based elements. Even if you were severely disabled, you'd still be able to complete the vast majority of levels as long as you could control a cursor. This is another of the game's many positive qualities, not only because it allows more people to experience it fully, but also because it's a nice break from other puzzle games which often require or reward fast reaction times. The downside here is that it's also incredibly easy to cheat. Even right now, you could simply pause this video and recreate any of my designs with little effort. This is where the difference between a leaderboard and a histogram becomes important. Giving the player an entry on a public table makes it far more tempting to cheat since it labels them with a number that has their name attached to it. If you do poorly on some puzzle, you might feel embarrassed seeing your name next to such a bad score, or you might be drawn to cheat your way to the top so your name will be proudly up in lights for everyone else to see. Conversely, a histogram is completely impersonal. Everyone's anonymous, and you gain nothing by cheating since the only person who'll see your name attached to your score is you, and you know you cheated. There's also the question of what it would even mean to be first place on a SpaceChem leaderboard anyway. For the earlier stages, there's probably many scores tied on the cycles metric. This could be improved by using reactor and instruction counts as a tiebreaker, but even then you're likely to get many duplicate scores. You have to wonder if a scoreboard is really the right choice when first place is a 100-way tie. As a compromise, leaderboards are available, but only for friends, which preserves the appeal of ladder climbing while curbing the incentive to cheat. Rounding out this package of deep mechanics combined with a sensible scoring system is a set of intellectually stimulating problems to solve. First of all, on a macro level, it's easy to see how evenly new mechanics are introduced to keep things fresh. Tutorial, production stages, control switches for bosses, sensing, fusion, flip-flops, and then just when you think all the mechanics are exhausted, fixed piping for production stages. The only odd one out is the sixth world, which is understandable when you consider it as an opportunity to exploit all the previous mechanics before flip-flops arrive and blow the whole thing open again. It also doubles as a sort of fake-out, leading you to wonder if all the mechanics have been introduced, which makes the later ones even more exciting. This kind of even pacing, with some surprises along the way, is extremely effective at maintaining and rewarding interest, but the more important is the micro level, where individual puzzles are laid out. Even when no new mechanics are introduced, the campaign remains inventive and challenging thanks to an abundance of minor twists which push players to utilize existing tools more effectively. In some cases, it can be hard to articulate what makes a puzzle special, even if it's clearly felt as you make your way through the problem-solving process, but here's a few simple examples. Do something you've done before, but this time with only 2 bonders. Store and retrieve an atom depending on which one arrives at the input. Make an intimidatingly large molecule without causing collisions. It's worth pointing out that these tasks are themselves recycled as a sub-portion of later puzzles, again allowing players to capitalize on their acquired knowledge. Some challenges are so subtly crafted, it's enough to make you wonder what kind of next-level genius it takes to invent a problem so diabolical in the first place. Omega pseudoethene is a challenging enough concept, but what puts it over the top is the way none of the 16 input squares represent all 3 possible states. This means no matter where you place the sensor, it's impossible to be certain which molecule has arrived until you start manipulating it. Time after time, these kinds of quirks are thrown into the campaign so that it rarely feels like it's repeating itself. Of course, this doesn't mean there aren't some stumbles along the way. Brace yourself because this is French and it's going to sound very weird coming out of me. Sacre Bleu sticks out as being far too simplistic for the point it arrives at, but for the most part it's a steady procession of genuinely new challenges. Stop laughing. This is to say nothing of the many miniature snags players will encounter along the way as they start working out a solution. One truly amazing aspect of this genre is that it outsources much of the puzzle creation to the player. Because you're free to try so many different approaches, you're also free to accidentally get yourself into a bit of a mess. Make an erroneous assumption about how easy it will be to do something down the line, and you might find yourself frantically shuffling instructions around in an attempt to squeeze in just one more. I feel confident in saying, no matter how clever you are, if you've made it to the end, this has happened to you at least once, probably somewhat regularly. In a sense, you end up creating a plethora of little problems for yourself along the way. At times these almost seem intentional, like Zack is somehow 50 steps ahead, but the more likely explanation is that players are actually encountering totally separate versions of these events. Of course, the game deserves credit for the novel restrictions it imposes. While those can only stay still at sync instructions, paths can only overlap in certain ways, and reactors are only so many tiles wide. It's when your intellect happens to brush up against one of these constraints that you find yourself having to rethink your methods, perhaps discovering a better design along the way. Counterintuitively, the repetitive visuals make this process of refinement all the more engaging, not less. There are few, if any, hints to be gleaned from the terrain or the available tools, and nothing is ever emphasized by the user interface, so the onus lies entirely on the player to direct themselves. This aspect really shines thanks to certain mechanics like fusion, randomized inputs, unevenly balanced materials, and the fact that molecules don't have to be the exact same shape as the output example. Although an aspiring reaction engineer actually doesn't need any knowledge of chemistry, a little bit of maths does help. By checking out the atomic numbers of the inputs and outputs, you can make some decisions about what you'll fuse or store for later. It's also wise to look for any sort of symmetry in a molecule's bonds or easier ways they might be rearranged. Basically, these mechanics reward players with a cleaner or faster solution if they're able to clarify the problem in their mind before charging forth. But even if you overlook how important that planning element can be, the consistent layout of each puzzle means that the question is never what am I supposed to do, but instead how am I supposed to do it? Well, almost never. It's time to address the floating Illuminati pyramid in the room, bosses. Before we do, it's important not to conflate bosses with control switches. They're actually two somewhat separate mechanics. If you want to be hyper concerned about the accessibility or purity of the game, you could say switches constitute a flaw, since they introduce a skill-based element which wouldn't exist otherwise. Of course, the slowest available speed reduces that skill barrier to almost nothing, but that is slightly different from nothing. Anyway, the concept of controlling objects in real time via logic you've set up beforehand was the focus of the Steam Bureau of Engineering, one of Zach's previous games. The allure of setting up a chain of logic, which can then be executed by flipping switches, is obvious. The result of that switch is fully earned. Histograms are disabled for these levels so as not to turn them into a boring exercise in triggering interactions on the right cycle, but switches are a powerful optimization incentive anyway, because speeding up a reactor will increase its responsiveness, allowing that improvement to be felt in a more tangible way. With 4 different branching points, all of which are available in every reactor and which can also be chained together to produce a new effect, SpaceChem even manages to take this mechanic much further than Bureau, where it was the focus. This would all be great except for the bosses themselves. There's always some kind of gimmick in use to combat these monstrosities, but the interaction between the two is not always obvious ahead of time. A short description of each element tries to explain their purpose, but in reality you often have to build something to get a sense of how it'll work. On later stages, this process can take upwards of 20 minutes, which is then wasted when you realise some assumption you made about their function was mistaken or naive. If this happened just once, it might be alright, but approaching the next boss with the knowledge that your early work might all be a waste of time is truly disheartening. The simplest solution here would have been to cut all the bosses, but it's understandable why Zachtronics didn't want to pass up the opportunity to use switches, and they require some kind of outside stimulus, so it may as well be a boss. An alternate solution would be to include some kind of simulation mode where the player could click each component to trigger it, seeing the results directly. If you could test this stuff beforehand, they'd be much more in line with the other puzzles where the goal is always clear. It's worth pointing out that a simulation mode might destroy the catharsis of seeing your contraption finally get the job done for real, but that still seems like a better situation than what we have right now. Either way, once you've finished a boss for the first time, they're not such a big problem, but that leads me nicely to another complaint. You get one and only one save slot for every mission, which can heavily discourage you from deleting and starting over. This seems especially obvious since it became a standard feature of these games starting with Infinifactory, but I made this complaint before Infinifactory released, so I'm getting that dig in here too. I suppose since it's been fixed in later games I won't belabor the point, but it does stick out as one of SpaceChem's most serious flaws. Another criticism, which seems especially obvious in retrospect, is the disconnect between the story and gameplay. It's not that there's anything especially wrong with the story of SpaceChem. The prose is in a somewhat awkward place where it could have been more elaborate and evocative, but then again it might be deliberately straightforward so as not to overwhelm the player with challenging literature between challenging puzzles. The real issues are how loosely it feels connected to the gameplay, and that you're expected to imbibe large chunks of text all at once instead of more gradually. It's the presentation in general where SpaceChem is at its weakest. Thankfully, when you're inside reactors, the visuals are perfectly fine. The use of Alpha, Beta, Psi and Omega as reactor zones even adds some much needed visual flair, but outside of that, whenever the graphics try to represent something real, it can look pretty rough. In story illustrations, the perspective sometimes seems off, or at least wobbly, and in stages the mixture of softly painted backgrounds versus thick-lined, perfectly angular structures clashes hard. Unfortunately, even the wonderful soundtrack suffers from some presentation woes as well. Thematically, it's a great choice. The semi-classical vibe might not be an obvious fit at first, but after a while it really clicks. There's a sort of whimsy here, which seems to be hinting at the joy of science, like something that would play in an Albert Einstein documentary as he dramatically scrawls equations on a chalkboard. The problem is that, like the story, it also doesn't integrate with the game in any serious way. The whole thing just cycles through a playlist completely disconnected from the events on screen, and the bombastic style calls a bit too much attention to itself, sometimes being a distraction. Individually, each of these complaints about the story, visuals and music are relatively minor, but they stack up to provide an unfortunately amateur impression of the game as a whole. The saving grace is that you'll spend the vast majority of your time with SpaceChem in your own head, solving whatever problem lies in front of you. The rest has a tendency to melt away. For those who can get past the awkward beginnings and sometimes lackluster presentation, there's a black hole's worth of material to sink into. The tightly paced campaign has a huge amount of replay value, but it's also accompanied by a more loosely curated set of reaction net puzzles. Of course, this sacrifices the non-redundancy of the main campaign, but it's not exactly harmful either. Those who want to complete the well-crafted centerpiece then walk away are free to do so. Some others might return to solve a puzzle a day, even if the process is sometimes similar to before. Add on the ability to make and share custom puzzles with other players, and you have a complete package. It might even be fair to say that SpaceChem is a whole mini subgenre unto itself, like Sudoku or any other similar templates which can be arranged into countless configurations. Being a reaction engineer really is a lifetime pursuit if you want it to be. SpaceChem is Zachtronics' first commercial game, and in that sense we might think of it as their debut. However, it's important to recognise that Zach had been honing his craft with similar games for quite a while. SpaceChem directly benefits from that expertise. Although I had some harsh words for the tutorial, it's still leagues above some of the earlier stuff. Rough edges remain around the visuals, UI, story, and even music, but they too are a noticeable step up from previous offerings. More importantly, the many hours it takes to complete the campaign are spent carefully thinking about the gameplay, which is where SpaceChem really knocks it out of the solar system. What starts as a simple exercise in moving an atom across the screen escalates into advanced visual programming with genuinely interesting constraints and problems to mull over. There's a wide variety of chemicals to synthesize in SpaceChem, but by far the best ones it generates are the ones in your very own brain. In the next video, a close encounter of the third dimensional kind, so I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching.